Hello everyone, Wildnorwester here. I've had a few people ask about how I make my episodes, so I've made this behind the scenes video to show how I do them. I'll start by covering my writing process, then show you how I film, dub, and edit them. This will mainly be a demonstration of how I make my videos, and the opinions that I express within it are simply my 2 cents. Usually I'll do half an episode at once, but for the purposes of this video, I'll do the first scene of Ivo's Number, which is episode 1 of Adeline the Phantom Engine. And yes, I did pick that title as a reference to the TV series episode Philip's Number. Now, this upcoming video does contain minor spoilers for this episode, as I'll be showing the completed scene at the end of it. There are several ways that I come up with ideas for stories. Some are big, some are small, and some start small and grow. This mini-series, Adeline the Phantom Engine, is the latter. One of the things I enjoy doing is looking for openings in the Railway series and poking about within them. In this case, it started with a simple question. Why is Ivo Hugh number 7 of the Skarloey Railway and Duke number 8 when Duke arrived 30 years earlier? A couple of years ago, I saw this tweet, which put together a few tidbits of information from the supplementary Railway series material, as well as some of the stories that we know and love. That's when the answer came to me. Duke is number 8 because the number 7 slot was already occupied or recently vacated when he arrived. So, I now had the basic premise. Another number 7, who worked for the Skarloey Railway and the Ministry of Defence, who left, or went missing, before Ivo Hugh was built. Working from that, I outlined the plot for the 5 episodes of this miniseries. Once that was done, I had an idea of where the stories were going. So I set about writing. In writing, I've found that the goal is to get the characters to take the actions or ask the questions that further the plot in a natural manner that does not seem out of place. Sounds simple, but it sometimes takes a bit of planning. I'm going to use the opening scene of Ivo's Number as an example. In this scene, to get the plot rolling, I needed a character to ask the question that inspired this miniseries. Why is Ivo Hugh number 7 and Duke number 8 when Duke arrived first? It had to be a character who didn't know, which meant that my only options were Fred or Atlas, who were not on the Skarloey Railway in 1969 when Duke arrived. I decided that Atlas worked best for this scene, as in Sodor the modern years, he's only been on the Skarloey Railway for less than a year by the time these events happen, while Fred has been around since the late 1980s and could have already gathered some information. So now, I had who asked the question, the next thing I needed was why he asked it. I'd previously established in my series that the Alsdale Railway does charter trains for events such as weddings, corporate get-togethers, that sort of thing. I understand some real-life heritage railways do such events too. As such, I decided that the Skarloey Railway would also do them. There is a lot of preparation required for a wedding, and part of it is arranging the good luck package. We've seen this in the TV series episode Happily Ever After, where Thomas and Percy help arrange such a wedding package. So, the bride and groom who are hiring the wedding train in Ivo's Number may decide that they want to have the engine on their train as part of this. So they're deciding if they want Duke to pull the train as their something old, or Ivo Hugh as their something new. This provides a plausible reason for the 2 characters to be together at the Skarloey Railway sheds when Atlas arrives. Now, I have all the pieces in place to kickstart the plot. So, Atlas arrives, sees the bride and groom making their choice, and during the conversation, he makes the connection between Ivo Hugh's age and the engine's numbers being out of chronological order. This leads to him asking why this is the case. Duke and Ivo Hugh don't know what happened to Adeline, as it was before their arrival, but the other engines do, and they'll ask in the sheds that night. This is what sets the plot into motion. We now have this discrepancy brought up, and it's raised further questions from which the rest of the episode plot flows. I've found that once I have a starting point, it's a question of getting the characters to move from one plot point to the next, while giving them a plausible reason to do so. There's one final thing I'd like to say about inspiration, before I go on. I get ideas from several sources, not just openings in the Railway series. For example, as a writing challenge to myself, I asked the fans on Twitter what the worst episodes of seasons 8 to 16 were, in terms of writing. These will be adapted later on, in the mini-series and season 3. Another source of episode ideas is ongoing plot arcs. For example, the Devious Way trilogy that I put at the end of Season 2 of The Modern Years brings Diesel's character arc full circle. He's up to his old tricks again, but this time it's to help Duck with the trucks. It serves to finish off that stage of his development in my series. I've got a few such arcs running at the moment, some of which are obvious, and some which aren't marked out as clearly. I don't use that much equipment to film and produce my episodes. Given that the routes and models all exist within trains, most of what I use for filming is virtual. Having said that, there is still some hardware that's crucial. My filming and production is done on my home PC, which is the Dell G5 gaming laptop. It's beefy enough to run Trains 2019 at 60 frames per second, with most of the settings turned down, I will admit. Aside from a keyboard and mouse, two other main pieces of equipment are a Logitech F310 gamepad and a Behringer C-1U microphone with a pop shield attached. I originally bought the gamepad to play video games on my PC. However, when the controller iScripting was developed for Trains 2019, I realised I could use it to puppeteer the models. After getting permission from Riley, the creator of the script, I added this scripting to my models. This was done between filming my 10th anniversary remake of Desperate Measures and Duncan Gets Spooked. For the earlier episode, I had to use the on-screen eye controls and then crop out the user interface when the eyes were moving. You can tell when this is the case, as the eyes move slower with the on-screen controls than they do with the gamepad. The controller script for Trains 2019 adds additional options to the in-game control mapping. Of particular interest are the ones listed in the TTTE script controls settings. The 4 directions refer to the eye movement on the trains themselves. The only other controls I have mapped in this are to change the faces, which are mapped to the left and right shoulder buttons on the gamepad. Under General Controls, I have some of the other keypad buttons mapped to functions that I use the most. The Y and A buttons increase and decrease the throttle respectively. X sets the throttle to 0, and B applies the handbrake, which makes the train stop a little bit quicker. Up and down on the direction pad control the zoom, left on the pad pauses the game, and right toggles the in-game interface. However, these are only half of the controls. I also wanted to map some other functions, such as moving the camera and toggling Bandicam, to the controller, so that I had all of the commands that I needed in the palm of my hand. However, some of these cannot be remapped to the controller in Trains, and must be handled by the keyboard itself. So I found this free program called Antimicro, which allows you to map controller buttons to various keyboard buttons. It runs in the background, and puts those inputs into Windows when the mapped controller button is pressed. F12 is used to toggle Bandicam recording, so I mapped this to the start button on the controller. Shift slows down both zoom and rotation in-game, so I mapped this to the left trigger button. This means that I can hold it down while panning and zooming to give finer and slower control. When doing these allocations, I was careful not to use any controls that I'd already mapped in Trains. As the left analog stick was used for eye movement, I mapped the right stick to the arrow keys, which gave me camera movement. It's made shots such as this one, where the camera pans around, much easier. Moving the camera with a stick instead of the arrow keys feels much more natural, and I've also got the controls for the train right next to it, where I can easily reach them. So now, Percy's going to help me demonstrate all of these functions. Firstly, Bandicam is already filming. If I demonstrated the toggling of it, you'd just get this. Right, so we have zoom. As you can see, that's rather fast. The same thing goes for camera panning. So now I'm holding down the left trigger, which is mapped to the shift button, and this slows down both of these functions. For the eye movement, it's just a question of moving the left stick. Even though I've only filmed one episode with this so far, I can already say that doing big, expressive eye movements is easy. Doing subtle ones, such as an engine only looking slightly down or across, is tricky. Changing the faces is just a matter of tapping the shoulder buttons until I get to the face I'm after. Usually when doing this, the script will jump to the first face listed in the model's config file, and then scroll through to the last one. So, doing a face change shot is now simply a question of selecting the appropriate face using these controls, then editing out the bit where it's jumping between the faces. And then finally, we have throttle controls. An interesting aspect of the TTTE script is that it will still run when the game is paused, even though the rest of the game doesn't. As you can see here, I'm still able to move Percy's eyes and change his faces, despite the game being in a paused state. This script has made the process of filming Thomas episodes in Trains a lot easier and quicker, compared to what we had when I started in 2011. I'd like to demonstrate what I mean. As it happens, I still have the 2009 style Percy in my library, which I started with when I filmed the original Desperate Measures. The main difference between this model and the 2006 style models is that the textures on this model are rendered. As far as the faces and the scripting for them goes, they're more or less the same. The model itself still holds up reasonably well in Trains 2019. These models used what was called chameleon scripting, rather than the AJS superscript, which is the basis of the controller script. Changing the faces was handled by the locomotive properties in Surveyor, and you had to click through the list until getting to the face you were after. They also didn't have directional eyes. This was introduced on the 2010 style models. Now, most of my early episodes were filmed in Trains 2010, and I went straight from that to Trains A New Era. Trains 2010 did not support the editing of locomotive properties from driver mode. They could only be changed when editing the session in Surveyor. So in order to make a face changing shot, I would need to set up the session with one face, then set up a static camera at the angle I wanted for the shot. After filming the locomotive in that position, I would then have to exit the session, change the face, and then relaunch the session and film it again. This gave me two shots with different faces but identical camera angles. This resulted in an obvious jump, especially in shots with lots of sky visible due to the clouds. So having the ability to change faces at the push of a button, without having to stop filming, has made things a lot smoother. Filming a face change now takes seconds instead of minutes, and there's no background discontinuity. The microphone I mentioned is self-explanatory, but there's one more piece of equipment I use when filming. I find it easier to work with printed scripts, and I usually add notes to them while I'm filming. Stuff like what speed engines are going at, what time of day it is, the weather settings, that sort of thing. This makes it easier if I need to come back and film pickup shots later on. In order to film a scene, there's a bit of setup required. After selecting the required route, I'll create a new session for it in Trains 2019. Once this loads, my first step is to find the location where the scene needs to take place. Sometimes it'll be in a specific location like Croven's Gate or the sheds. Other times it may be a question of doing some location scouting until I find an appropriate siding or section of track. Once this is done, I'll next need to add the main characters. In this case, I'm going to start with Atlas, as his arrival kicks this off. He'll have a works train, which is a coach for the workmen, plus some trucks for their tools and supplies. I'll also usually add loads to open wagons to make them look busy. In this case, it's debris to imply that the workmen have been out clearing up the tracks. Now that that's in place, I'll add Duke and Ivo Hugh, the other two main characters for this scene. Once they're in place, I'll usually change the engine's faces to whatever they need to be wearing when the scene starts. This means there's less initial setup to do in Driver when I start filming. With these characters in place, the next thing is to get Atlas to stop where he needs to. This can be done manually, but takes a lot of trial and error as well as time and bloopers. Doing it manually, I've gotten up to 10-12 outtakes in order to get a train to stop where needed. As such, I'll usually use a track mark for these. This is just an invisible marker on the track, which triggers the AI drivers in the game to stop. I'll usually name them with the engine that needs to stop on them, and to lower the trigger distance a bit. When saving the session, I'll usually give it the episode title, followed by the scene number and a letter indicating its sequence within the scene. Next up, I add the human characters. In this case, the bride and groom-to-be. Originally, I was going to have the thin controller with them, but then I decided that a workman would escort them to talk to the engines instead. As these are just very minor characters, I'll be using pre-made models for them, rather than doing specific ones. I usually lock the route layer when placing figures. This prevents route objects, such as station platforms, from accidentally being moved or rotated when this isn't wanted. Trains always places objects on the ground, so in cases like this, where the ground is actually an elevated platform above the terrain, I usually need to adjust the height of the figures. Now, with the key characters in place, the next thing is to fill out the background. For these, I use pick lists. These are collections of rolling stock, all listed together for convenience. Instead of having to search through my entire rolling stock library every time, I can just pick what I need from this subset. I've got 2 for standard gauge rolling stock, goods and passengers, then the cast for each line and narrow gauge railway. So, I'm just adding some rolling stock to the interchange siding, just picking something that looks good. This is the first time I've used some of these freight cars, as I've added a lot of content to trains since I finished Couriers and Concerns. I've found quite a few talented model makers during my hiatus. Back when I first started, things like trucks would have a different model per livery. With more recent rolling stock, there's just one model with multiple scripted liveries, attachments and loads. I also like to try and tell a story with some of the background details. In this case, we've got some troublesome trucks with slate next to some empty Scarlowy Railway slate trucks, so it looks like they've just been loaded and are awaiting pickup. Next up is the works. Depending on the camera angles, this may appear in the background of some of the shots, so I'm going to put some trucks and coaches here as though they're dropping off supplies or are under repair. Again, part of that background storytelling. I enjoy doing that sort of thing. There's been a couple of times when I've put in Easter eggs for upcoming episodes. I think the best known of these is when I had Olivia go past on a flat car in the episode before she was introduced, so that it was showing her being delivered. With the background trains in place, the last thing is to set up some background action. In this case, it'll be Peter the heavy goods engine going past with a fast goods train bound for Barrow. Yes, he is painted blue now. There's about a 3-month time skip between the end of Couriers and Concerns and this scene, which picks up in the spring of 2012. During this time, a few minor changes happened and Peter getting a new livery was one of them. My last step whenever I'm setting up a session is to adjust the session rules. In this case, as I'm using the AI driver for Atlas, I'll add the max permitted speed rule. This limits AI drivers to a speed set in the config file of the locomotive they're driving. In this case, it's 18 miles per hour. The next rule, and one that I usually use, is session startup options. This specifies things such as starting time, weather, imperial and metric units, that sort of thing. I actually set up my own copy of these rules and tweaked it to some of the settings that I use each time. In this case, I just need to specify the starting time. With that done, I just need to save the session and everything is ready for filming. Well, almost everything. There's one small thing I need to check. When I placed that track mark for Atlas, I had to estimate the location for it. I'd like to have Atlas stop next to Ivo Hugh without overshooting, so I'll need to do a rehearsal to see if he will. Now after launching driver, I've jumped to Atlas. Next up, I need to select the AI driving mode, which is in the bottom right of the screen. I then give him the order to drive to the track mark I specified earlier. Now, it's just a question of watching and seeing what happens. Now from this, I can tell that I've put the track mark a little too far forward. As such, I'm going to have to move it back. It is tricky to get a train to stop precisely where you want it to in this game, and that's due to the physics of the simulation. So I've returned to the session in Surveyor, and I'm going to move the track mark back a bit. I think this spot should do it. We'll have to see how it goes. Now with that done, time for another test run. This time around, he's stopped more or less where I want him, so I'll go with this position. With that all in place, now it's time to start filming the scene itself. I usually film my scenes in order, so I've jumped into driver in the session that I set up earlier. Unlike the rehearsal run I did with Atlas, this time I'm going to need to set the directions of the character's eyes before I actually start filming or anything else. Due to how the scripting handles eye movement, this has to be done in driver. It can't be preset in Surveyor like with the faces. For eyes that don't need to move while on screen, this can be done using the on-screen controls, which will later be hidden while filming. So with that done, I've now given Atlas his orders and paused the game. Now, the AI driver only takes control of the throttle and direction for the train, which means that I can still control the eyes and faces with the handheld controller, which is what I'm doing in this shot to have Atlas look over. This is the point where I'd usually start Bandicam recording if I wasn't using it to film this behind the scenes footage. Now that he's stopped, I'll leave it there for a little bit longer in order to give some time for the dialogue. Now, in order to save time, I'm going to set up a second session with Atlas already in this stopped position. To this end, I've taken note of where he is positioned relative to the others. The front of his water tanks lines up with the front of Ivo Hugh's cylinders, more or less. So I've opened up this session in Surveyor again, and I'm moving Atlas to where he's stopped. So now that he's in position, I've saved this session with a new letter after it as part 1B. Now, I launch this session, and again I'm going to have to set up the eyes. Now that Atlas is stopped, I'm going to need to get Peter moving. Again, due to the physics of the simulation, it'll take him a little while to get up to speed. I'm thinking around 22 miles per hour would be a decent speed for a mainline goods train. We don't want them to go too fast. So that's at 65% throttle, and I've noted that on the script in pen. With Peter up to speed, the next thing is to pull him back so he can enter the scene. As I've mentioned earlier, the ability to edit trains while in driver mode was introduced in Trains: A New Era, and it saves so much time when doing this sort of background action. Before this, I'd have to load the session each time and wait for the background train to get up to speed. Now, I can just get them going once, then move them back for as many passes as needed. Now that that's set, I'm going to line up the shot. I usually try to use the rule of thirds when lining up shots, that is, lining up key elements of the shot 1/3 of the way across the screen, either vertically or horizontally. With that in place, it's now a question of unpausing the game and letting Peter go past. He won't be seen in this shot, but his smoke will be seen going past above and behind Ivo Hugh. In a shot like this, it's more about having the sound of him passing by rather than the actual visual. Even though we don't see him, we're still aware that something is going past. If you listen closely, you can hear his puffing going from the right stereo channel to the left stereo channel. Now that Peter's passed, it's time for the next shot. So I'm going to pull Peter back to his starting point, line up the next shot, and film it again. I'll end this part of the video here, as it's just repetition from here until the end of the scene. Before I go any further, there are a couple of other types of shots I'd like to demonstrate, which weren't used in this scene. The first are moving camera shots. I usually use these when I want a zoom shot or a point of view shot. I do this using a special locomotive called the flying cam. It looks like a giant TV camera on the outside, but it's the internal cab view where the magic happens. It has just a single cab camera with no visible cab mesh. As such, you can pan it around to all directions and zoom it while moving along the track. This allows for all sorts of shots including flybys, etc. For zoom shots, I'll usually set up a straight line of invisible track, then put the flying camera on it. If I'm making a point of view shot, I'll put it in front of whichever character I'm filming with. That way, the sound effects of their movement will also be recorded. Once the flying cam has been set up, it's just a question of jumping into the cab view, then setting the throttle and recording. The other trick shot I'd like to demonstrate is stop motion animation. Back when I was filming Sodor the early years, I decided to use this to show humans moving around in order to mimic the style of the early pre-CGI years of the TV series. In order to film a stop motion shot, I'll set up a static camera in Surveyor at the angle of the shot. I'll then put the human in their starting position and save the session. I'll then put the human in the next position, then save that as another session, and so on until the human has moved to where they need. Normally, the last shot is just the scene without the human, as they've moved off screen or into a building or a coach or wherever they're going. Once that's done, I'll film all the shots using the static camera I set up earlier. Then it's just a question of editing them together with a fade between them. I usually use a half-second crossfade. This was also how I did the shot of Gordon through the years in the episode Swan Song, although in that case I did it with a tracking camera in Surveyor rather than a static camera. I just sent Gordon through in his different versions at the same speed, then edited the shots together and added some film grain effects and so on. Now that the raw footage has been filmed, it's time to tell the story. I use Audacity to do my audio editing. Usually, I'll open up a blank project and the recordings from voice actors. If there's narration from me, I'll record it on my microphone in sequence. But this episode starts with a line from Atlas, so I'll find that, then copy and paste it in.
I say, Grandpuff, what's going on here? I say, Grandpuff, what's going on here? I say, Grandpuff, what's going on here?
I usually paste each line into a separate stereo channel in Audacity in order to make equalization easier later on. Next up is a reply from Duke. Again, that's just a matter of copying and pasting.
This lady and gentleman will be chartering a train for their wedding in a few weeks.
Then Ivor Hugh explains a bit more, so that's copied and pasted again.
They're deciding if they'd like me as their something new or Duke as their something old. You know, for that good luck thing.
Doing this part of the dubbing is mostly a question of copying and pasting. Now, there's some narration needed from me. As it's being done by me, it's not pre-recorded. Instead, as I mentioned earlier, I'll just record it in place. Start that again. Both bride and groom blinked, then started discussing it amongst themselves. Duke and Ivor Hugh looked over, to see Atlas looking quite puzzled. Following this, it's just a question of copying and pasting further lines until I reach the end of the scene. So, I've now put all of the lines in place. As you can see, the recordings vary in volume depending on who recorded them, how they did it, and so on. For example, this line here from the thin controller came through at a higher volume than the others. So in order to sort this out, I select all the tracks and just apply the normalize effect using the default settings. This adjusts each audio track in the project to an identical volume. Next up, I will need to get rid of the static that comes from my microphone. You can see there's some noise at the end of my line of narration here. In order to deal with this, I'll use the noise reduction effect. Firstly, I run this to get a sample of the noise that needs to be removed. I then apply this to the whole project, which removes all of it. This makes all of my recordings clearer and gets rid of that static. However, this does not affect the lines from the voice actors, as their recordings are clean to begin with. Before Ivo could reply, the wedding couple returned with the thin controller. Finally, once all this is done, I will export this as an MP3. I usually name them Narrator 1, Narrator 2, and so on, depending on which scene they're for. This is left over from when I first started, and did all of the narration myself. Now, back in those days, I didn't have much practice dubbing or narrating episodes, so my delivery was very rushed, with no pacing or proper emotion in it. For example, take this scene from my remake of Super Rescue, the 10th video that I made.
Shush 199, Patrick replied. He had been on the Northwest Railway before, and knew that the steam engines wouldn't take too kindly to that sort of attitude. It's their railway, after all. Not for long, 199 continued. Our controller says the steam engines give us a bad image. Of course we do, replied Henry angrily. We show what frauds you are.
Can't yourselves engines? James put in. If something goes wrong, you care nothing for your trains. You just sit there and moan for a fitter. We bring him home, even if it is only on one cylinder.
It's very rushed. I got lots of comments about the rush to delivery and how it was hard to understand. For seasons 3 and 4 of the early years, I must admit, I still didn't quite get it. I recorded the lines how I did before, but I slowed them down using a change tempo effect in Audacity. This resulted in slow, emotionless delivery, like this.
What are you talking about? They're rude and will never miss a chance to trick an engine. Rubbish. It's the passenger coaches you've got to watch out for. What do you mean? James asked, not sure if he was hearing the other engine correctly.
It wasn't until I switched to voice actors in season 5 of the early years that I realised what I was doing wrong. It was the pacing between the lines that was missing, as well as some emotion in the delivery. This led me to introduce an additional step to my audio editing process, that of pacing. This involves going through the completed MP3 and adjusting the silence between each line in order to give it time to sink in. There's no hard and fast rule for how much of a gap there should be between lines. It's just a question of listening and finding what sounds natural. It needs to sound like the characters have had a moment to absorb what they've heard before responding. I will also usually clean up any sounds between the lines, such as breathing in or clicks from the microphones. Again, this is a rather repetitive endeavour. I must admit, it is the part that I find most tedious, but it is worth it. Now for the final stage. This is where all the video clips, dubbing tracks, music, sound effects, and other elements come together to tell a story. It's my favourite part of the process. I use Vegas Movie Studio 13 to do my editing. Here, I've loaded the template that I have set up for my episodes, and saved it with the title of this episode. I've got 8 separate tracks set in this template, each of which has a different purpose. The text and video overlay tracks are mostly used for titles and borders, usually during the opening and closing credits. The video and voice are the video and sound respectively from the trains recordings. Narration and music are self-explanatory. Finally, there are 2 tracks for sound effects. The first is used for effects such as whistles, crashes, brake squeals, etc. The other sound effects track is for ambient noise, such as birds, ocean waves, crickets chirping, that sort of thing. Firstly, I'm going to have to change the border of the title sequence. I have them colour-coded, depending on where the episode takes place. Green is for the Northwest Railway, red for the Skarloey Railway, and Jock yellow for the Alsdale Railway. With the border in place, I'll next set up the titles for the episode. I'll usually list the starring characters in the opening titles. In this case, Adeline is the one who stars in this episode, so she'll get star billing. Some episodes, mostly those which have an ensemble cast, won't have any starring characters. Vegas is good software and I've gotten to know it well over the years, but one inconvenient aspect of it is that it turns on the auto ripple function by default. This means that when a section of the video is deleted, the sections after it will automatically be moved back to fill the gap. That's what just happened with that last section of title text. While this function does have its uses, I find that it cramps my editing style, so I'll usually turn it off. With the title set, my next step is to import the shots filmed for this scene, as well as the narration track. Firstly, I'll put the narration down on the track for it. Usually, I edit the shots to fit the narration, but for action shots, I may adjust the narration to match. Trimming the shots is simply a question of splitting the video at the required points, then deleting the bits not used. In this case, the first 4 shots will be trimmed from within the behind-the-scenes footage you saw earlier. For a shot like this, where a character is arriving, I'll cut the shot after they have stopped and rested for a moment. Then, I'll line up the end of that clip at the end of whatever line of narration it's meant to go with. Once in place, I'll then extend it back to the end of the previous shot. As this is the opening shot for the episode, I'll put a fade in on it where it comes out of the title sequence. Sometimes it takes a few tries before I'm satisfied with the edit of a shot. I may play around with it for a little bit until I'm happy with how it looks. Although I do use the sound effects from trains itself, they are rather loud initially and often drown out the narration.
I say, Grandpuff, what's going on here?
As such, I'll usually drop the volume of these sounds so they're not overwhelming.
I say, Grandpuff, what's going on here?
For these next few shots, I'll need to have Peter passing by as part of the background action. As I mentioned while filming, we won't see him in this first shot, but instead just hear him approaching. So I'm going to pick a point at which he can be heard approaching and start the shot there. Then, it's just a question of lining up the end of the shot.
Chartering a train for their wedding in a...
For this next shot, I've started it at a moment where Peter is far enough away that he'll be passing by for most of Ivo Hugh's line.
They're deciding if they'd like me as their something new or...
I've then gone back and tweaked the previous shot so that the sounds match up. In the shot after that, we'll see Peter's smoke going past. In order to align this, I've split the earlier shot at the point where his smoke is lined up behind the white salt wagon with the face. I've then found the corresponding moment in the next shot and lined that up on this split. Then, I've deleted the start of this second shot and just extended it back to meet the end of the previous one. After this shot, Peter's train has gone past. There's no more background action to account for, so now I just need to insert the next shots and trim them to match the narration. While filming this conversation, I forgot that I would need a shot of Ivo, Hugh and Atlas together, with Ivo looking happy. I initially tried zooming on an existing shot to make it look a little bit different, but I wasn't satisfied with that, so I launched trains and filmed an additional shot instead. I've now loaded this pickup shot into the project and put it in place. From this point, editing is pretty much a question of putting the shots on the timeline, trimming them, lining them up and then lowering the volume. It's a conversational scene, so there's not much in the way of action. So, for scenes like this, where there isn't much movement, I'll usually try to change the shot every 10 to 12 seconds at most. I feel that if a static shot stays for too long, it can get boring for the viewer, but that's just my 2 cents. An extreme example of this is the episode Expectations, from Season 5 of Sodor the Early Years. Unlike other episodes, this focused on the Hat family, which meant that non-animated human characters were in the forefront of every shot, rather than the animated trains. In order to keep some movement on the screen, I tried to have trains passing by in the background of as many scenes as possible. I've almost finished editing this scene for Ivo's number now, but there are still a few things left to do. Firstly, a correction is needed for the narration.
Thank you.
With that, the 3 engines headed off to continue their work. Except 3 engines didn't move off. Duke is staying at the shed while the other 2 leave. I did try trimming out the word 3, but that left a noticeable glitch in the audio. After recording some replacement narration, I edited it in place of the original line.
Thank you.
With that, Atlas and Ivo Hugh left to continue their work. Next, this final shot of the engines departing needed to have the pauses edited out. This was needed as I had to switch control from Atlas once he started moving, to Ivo Hugh to get him moving, then to Duke so that the static camera would hold while the trains moved off screen. With that done, my next step was to add some countryside ambient noise. This particular sound effect comes from a website called freesfx.co.uk. When I'm editing, I'll keep note of who made the music and sound effects used in the episodes, so that I can put them in the credits. As such, they're usually listed in order of appearance. This first ambient track was a little too intrusive, with some of the birdsong.
Gentlemen will be chartering a train for their wedding in a few weeks.
So I swapped it out for a more subtle one. I've found that adding these ambient sounds in the background helps provide some unity to the sound of the scene. They're designed to loop over and over, so I can repeat them as many times as needed. Now, when pausing trains, the game will fade out the audio, then fade it in again when resuming the action. In shots like this, where I've paused it for special effects, that means there's a noticeable dropout in the audio where the pauses were edited out.
Thank you.
With that, Atlas and Ivo Hugh left to continue their work. To overcome this, I'll usually rip the audio of that shot and put the sounds from it into the sound effects track. It's more or less a sound effects band-aid. After adjusting it to match the video volume, the dropout is covered up.
To tell you when the shed's tonight.
I've also extended the last shot of this scene 1 second beyond the end of the narration. This is where it will fade through into the first shot of scene 2. I also decided to use part of this final shot in the title sequence. To do this, I just copied the shot to the start of the title sequence, muted the audio, and trimmed it to the end of the fade-in for the second set of title text. This will be where it finishes fading through to the next shot in the title sequence. I then adjusted the zoom and panning on the shot in order to account for the border. Before I proceed, I'd like to talk about the use of music in my videos. I didn't get a chance to discuss that with this example scene, but I feel it is an important part of filmmaking. Music can be quite powerful. For example, take the episode Duncan Gets Spooked. The finale, where Duncan goes up onto the bridge and thinks he sees a ghost, is very atmospheric and chilling. A large part of this comes from the music itself. It's haunting, and the violins at the start help create an eerie feel to it. Another example of how I've used this is in the episode Doncaster Drawn. This takes place in Season 1 of Sodor the Modern Years, and marks Gordon's return after an absence of 6 episodes following a very nasty accident. While he was being repaired, the Fat Controller hired Tornado to fill in for him. While on an excursion train, Tornado stops for water and a photo shoot. Then, we have this moment.
Suddenly, a deep whistle sounded out, and Tornado heard the chuffing of a steam engine approaching on the middle track. He frowned.
Who's that?
It wasn't a whistle he recognized. The two express engines looked closely at each other, and Gordon's eyes flicked up to Tornado's nameplate for a moment.
So you're my replacement?
Gordon joked.
That music, by Captain Punjab, helps create a triumphant atmosphere for that scene. It underlines the point of Gordon's back. It enhances the story. I'd like to demonstrate what that scene would feel like without music.
Who's that?
It wasn't a whistle he recognized. The two express engines looked closely at each other, and Gordon's eyes flicked up to Tornado's nameplate for a moment.
So you're my replacement?
Gordon joked.
It's just a shot of Gordon arriving. Nothing special about it. It's not a moment like the first version. Had I used a different piece of music, then the scene would have a different feel again. Let's try it with the theme for Bertie's coach tour.
Who's that?
It wasn't a whistle he recognized.
The two express engines looked closely at each other, and Gordon's eyes flicked up to Tornado's nameplate for a moment.
So you're my replacement,
Gordon joked. It is a subjective choice as to which piece suits a scene best. Sometimes I'll try several different pieces before I find one that fits the feel I'm going for. I also try not to overuse music. There are some scenes that do benefit from silence. I'd like to finish by saying that Junior Campbell and Mike O'Donnell made some truly iconic music for the series, and several fans have done fantastic jobs at recreating these in their own styles. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank those fans who've allowed me to use their music. Once I've finished filming and editing an episode, there is still some finishing touches that need to be added. At this point, the episode Ivo's number is not complete, so I can't demonstrate these on this particular video. Instead, I'm going to use this behind the scenes video that you're watching now as an example. Normally, before adding the credits, I'll render a rough cut of the video. I'll usually watch this video with Vegas open and make any tweaks such as length of shots, etc. if needed. I'll also take 6 screenshots from this rough cut. Here are some I prepared earlier. Now, the closing credits are approximately 30 seconds, so that means these shots will need to be approximately 5 seconds each. So I'll add these to the timeline, then put a half-second crossfade between each of them. Next up is the credits themselves. Again, I have a template for these. This template includes some standard credits, such as the route makers, model makers, and face artists whose work I've used. Generally, for these, I will list everyone whose stuff I've got in my trains library. Keeping track of exactly whose models and routes I've used in every shot would slow down the process of filming, so I've adopted this blanket approach in order to ensure nobody gets missed out. I'll start by changing the episode title at the top, then updating the voice cast. These will be listed in order of appearance. In this case, it'll be Atlas, Duke, Ivo Hugh, the Thin Controller, Tornado, and Gordon. Next up is the music and sound effects. As you saw earlier, I keep a list of whose music and sound effects that I use. It's simply a question of copying and pasting these lists into the relevant sections of the credits. I do have a standalone credit for the opening and closing themes, as well as the intro ditty, as these are used in every episode. After completing the credits roll, the final step is to add the closing music. I usually try to line it up, so that the end of the lead-in finishes with the last shot of the episode. Then there's that bomb beat and the credits start. Depending on how it lines up, I may need to tweak the slideshow and credits roll slightly. If this is a cliffhanger, then this is also where I'll put the to be continued text, while the outro is playing. With that done, I'll then render the video. I have a preset configured in Vegas for 1080p high resolution at 60 frames per second. So, that's how I make my episodes from concept to finished video. I hope you enjoyed watching this and that it proves useful. Now, as promised, here's the scene I was using as an example. Please note, this is the rough cut of the scene, and I still don't have the rest of the shots for the title sequence.
I say, Grandpuff, what's going on here?
This lady and gentleman will be chartering a train for their wedding in a few weeks.
They're deciding if they'd like me as their something new, or Duke as their something old. You know, for that good luck thing.
You could have Atlas here as both. He worked with us on the Mid-Sodor Railway decades ago, but only arrived here a few months ago.
Both bride and groom blinked, then started discussing it amongst themselves. Duke and Ivo Hugh looked over, to see Atlas looking quite puzzled.
Are you all right, Atlas?
Something new? If I may ask, Ivo Hugh, when were you built?
Oh, back in 1996. I'm only 16 years old. Just a wee lad, as Donald and Douglas call me.
But, Grandpuff, I thought Stuart told me you came here in 1969.
That's correct.
Then how come you're number 8 and Ivo's number 7? Shouldn't it be the other way around?
I did ask about that, but I was told to wait until I was a bit older.
That was a few years ago, as I recall.
So you can tell me now, then.
I'm afraid not, Ivo. I wasn't here for it myself.
You weren't?
No. All I really know is that Adeline had her accident a few months before I was found.
Before Ivo could reply, the wedding couple returned with the thin controller.
Duke, you'll be taking the wedding train.
So it's something old then. I will be happy to help.
Thank you, we appreciate it, replied the groom. As the couple and thin controller walked off, Ivo Hugh shot Duke a curious look.
I'll talk to the others and ask them to tell you in the sheds tonight.
Thank you.
With that, Atlas and Ivo Hugh left to continue their work.